The term luxury can mean many things to many different people. When it comes to the automotive sector, buyers who typically associate a luxury brand know that the manufacturer will put a high emphasis on comfort, technology, and above all, quality. Now, Hyundai first started their entrance into this category with the original Hyundai Genesis sedan back in 2008. Now, back then, it was designed to be a BMW 5 Series competitor, with Hyundai having the BMW right in its crosshairs when they introduced this thing back in 2007. Now, today, Genesis has evolved to become their own standalone luxury brand, and they currently offer 3, soon to be 4 models here in the States: the compact G70, this midsize G80, the flagship G90 sedan, and of course, the upcoming GV80 flagship SUV, which should be a hot seller whenever it does go on sale. Now, unlike most of its Japanese rivals, Genesis didn't just take a mainstream front drive platform and transform it for luxury car duty. They instead started from scratch with a rear drive architecture and the availability of V8 power, which is typically what's associated with a luxury branded vehicle. Now, today, Genesis has the potential to go toe-to-toe with the best from Japan, but the company wants to go a little bit further than the Japanese. They're going after the stalwart German players, which typically dominate the segment. And in today's video, we're going to go over some of the reasons why Genesis has the potential to be a tier 1 luxury player. Now, to understand how Genesis became its own standalone luxury player, we need to first talk about the history of the Hyundai Genesis, because Hyundai first thought of the idea for the Genesis back in 2003. Now, back then, the company was planning to do this as a standalone luxury brand on its own. However, the economic recession in the US started in 2008, and Hyundai made the conscious decision not to launch a new brand due to the economic recession. Now, when Hyundai finally took the wraps off of the new Hyundai Genesis sedan concept in New York City back in 2007, it was designed to be a fighter to the then brand new E60 generation BMW 5 Series. Hyundai said that they had targeted the BMW right in their crosshairs. However, the structural rigidity of the new Genesis sedan was about 14% more stiff, and Hyundai basically promised this thing offered the performance of a 5 Series, the interior space of a 7 Series, all for the price of a BMW 3 Series. Now, consumers were really impressed with the Genesis concept when they first took the wraps off. A lot of people said it looked very sleek, very upscale, and it definitely didn't remind you of any Hyundai product before it. Now, when the final production version was shown at the North American International Auto Show back in 2008, it was based right off of that concept they showed in New York City. However, they offered it with a 3.8-liter naturally aspirated V6 and a 4.6-liter naturally aspirated V8. Now, the V8 offered up to 375 horsepower, while the outside stayed very true to the concept's sleek design language, and it was a huge hit for Hyundai. Now, when the vehicle first initially went on sale, the V6 started at around $33,000, while the V8 was around $38,000. Now, back then, this was even cheaper than vehicles like the Chrysler 300, which already undercut most of the European luxury space by several thousands of dollars, which made the Hyundai Genesis a huge hit. And in 2012, which was the best year of the Genesis sedan, Hyundai managed to sell a little over 36,000 units. Now, in the performance department, Hyundai had typically lagged behind most of the competition. However, if you guys chose the 3.8-liter V6, which offered up to 290 horsepower, you would get to 60 in around 6 seconds. Those of you who ponied up for the V8, the 4.6, would get 0 to 60 performance in around 5.3 seconds. That was unheard of for Hyundai during its time, and it really matched a lot of the Japanese competition. It was really encroaching on some of the German competition as well. Now, a couple years later, Hyundai actually refreshed the Hyundai Genesis sedan and added a new 5-liter R-Spec V8 model, which offered up to 429 horsepower. Now, back then, when this vehicle was brand new in 2011, Ford had just rolled out the new Coyote V8 Ford Mustang, which also offered a 5-liter V8, which was their own version, but that actually had about 16 less horsepower versus the Hyundai's 5-liter V8. In 2010, Hyundai actually expanded the Genesis lineup with the Genesis Coupe, which was designed to go head-to-head with vehicles like the Nissan Z, the Ford Mustang, the Chevrolet Camaro, and the Dodge Challenger. Now, unlike the Genesis sedan on which it was based, the Coupe was significantly smaller, over a foot shorter overall, and about 800 pounds lighter. It offered a choice of either a 2-liter turbo 4-cylinder with a 6-speed manual or a 6-speed automatic, or you could also get it with a 3.8-liter naturally aspirated V6, which also came with a 6-speed manual or a 6-speed automatic. Genesis or Hyundai later updated the car to include an 8-speed automatic transmission, and you could also get almost 350 horsepower if you guys chose the 3.8 models. Now, thankfully, the coupe version was designed to be more of a sports car, so it was significantly cheaper. Hyundai actually had the starting price of around $25,000 when that vehicle first went on sale back in 2010. Now, in order to complete the family of luxury vehicles, Hyundai then launched the flagship Equus sedan a year later after the Genesis Coupe came out. And this was a vehicle that was really unheard of from a Korean car company. The Equus sedan was designed to go head-to-head with vehicles like the BMW 7 Series and the Mercedes-Benz S-Class, while doing it at a significant price discount. Now, to do that, Hyundai essentially took the Genesis sedan and stretched it by about 7 inches, making the 4.6-liter V8 as standard, eventually replacing it with the 5-liter V8 in 8-speed automatic in 2012. Sales were relatively good for a vehicle that was designed to be a high-value vehicle. However, they still trailed a lot of the Japanese and German competition. Now, as sales of the Hyundai Genesis family continued to be a surprising success for parent company Hyundai, the company finally made the conscious decision on November 4th, 2015 to finally separate Genesis to be its own standalone luxury player. Now, back then, the Hyundai Genesis sedan was due for a redesign, and the second generation Genesis was launched in 2015, still under the Hyundai Genesis name, eventually being launched as the Genesis G80, which is the vehicle that I have here to be the mid-size offering in the Genesis family. Now, of course, if you guys look back, the actual first vehicle to be launched as a Genesis vehicle was actually the flagship Genesis G90, which was then the all-new version of the Hyundai Equus sedan, which was launched back in 2017 as the Genesis G90. The G80 was eventually renamed that same year, a couple months after the G90 flagship sedan. Now, in order to move the Genesis brand further on market, Hyundai made the conscious decision to discontinue the Genesis Coupe, which 2016 was the last model year of the Coupe, and they discontinued the Coupe simply because it just wasn't deemed to be luxurious enough. You guys remember, the Coupe's mission was designed to be a head-to-head sports car with the likes of the Ford Mustang, the Chevrolet Camaro, and the Nissan Z. That vehicle had simply too harsh of a ride, it was too noisy and cheap on the inside, and it just didn't have the refinement that a luxury branded vehicle was going to have. So Hyundai decided to cancel the Genesis Coupe. We currently do not have a Coupe version or a Coupe in the Genesis lineup here in America. However, the company has promised they are working on a new Coupe that will essentially be based off of the Essentia concept car that they showed in New York a couple years ago. Now, in the world, there's an old saying, if you're going to copy or steal, you may as well steal from the best. And Genesis knew that if they were going to take on the Germans, they're going to need to have a pretty strong team as part of the executive department in order to lead the company towards success, which is why the brand hired 2 key people in terms of design. As you guys know, design is an important factor when shopping for a luxury vehicle. They hired Luc Donkerwolk to be their head of their design department. He, of course, was the former design head of Bentley, also part of Lamborghini and Audi. And then, of course, you guys all know Peter Schreier, who used to be part of the Volkswagen Group. He's also in charge of design management. He is the guy responsible for the first generation Audi TT and the Volkswagen New Beetle, both of which were huge hits in terms of design for their era. In terms of chassis dynamics, you guys know by now that Hyundai hired Albert Biermann from the BMW M division. That's right, the high performance M division, to be in charge of chassis dynamics. He also leads the Genesis team in terms of handling, driving feel, performance. So that's one of the reasons why the Genesis brand has a much higher performance rating versus the Hyundai vehicles on which parent company comes from. And of course, the CEO and president of Genesis is Mark Del Russo. He used to be the CEO of Audi. He's essentially the guy who's in charge, who kind of leads the team toward building vehicles that's going to be going head-to-head with a lot of the German competition. One of the things that I notice constantly whenever I drive a Genesis vehicle is these vehicles feel kind of like a melting pot of different cultures, because you have, guys from the German and Japanese and Korean team all kind of coming together in order to develop a vehicle that has its own brand identity, yet also has a lot of the high quality feel that you associate with a lot of those high-end luxury players. So now that we got the history and of course the history of the design team and the actual team that leads Genesis out of the way, let's talk a little bit about the current lineup of Genesis vehicles. Now, for the longest time, Genesis only had 2 vehicles in their staple, the G80, which is this one that I'm showing you here, and of course the flagship G90. But let's start from the beginning, or the smallest entry, which is the G70. Now, this is the compact, sportiest entry that Genesis offers to US consumers. As you guys know, it's essentially based off of the Kia Stinger platform, but it's been shortened by about 10 inches, and it's a traditional sedan as opposed to the hatchback. Buyers can take your pick between either a 2-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder with rear drive or all-wheel drive and the choice of a 6-speed manual transmission, or you can get a 3.3-liter twin turbocharged V6, which up to 365 horsepower. That's essentially the one that a lot of enthusiasts love. It only comes paired with an 8-speed automatic. Rear or all-wheel drive, of course, is going to be your option in terms of the drivetrain. And the G70 has been a huge hit for Genesis. It won North American Car of the Year and Motor Trend Car of the Year for 2019. And Genesis managed to sell about a little under 12,000 units in all of 2019. For comparison's sake, a Lexus IS, which has typically been one of the sales leader in the segment, Lexus only managed to sell about 14,000 IS models in the US in 2019, which really shows even though Genesis has had some problems with getting their dealership network established, they managed to sell nearly as many G70 sedans as Lexus sold the IS sedan, which has again been a huge, player in the luxury space. But what if you want something that's bigger than the G70? Well, that's where this G80 will come into play. This is the oldest model in the Genesis lineup. This generation, the second generation, came out back in 2015, and Genesis gave it an extensive refresh back in 2018 when they introduced this model that I'm standing in front of. This is the G80 Sport, which has the same 3.3-liter twin turbocharged V6 from the G70 and the Kia Stinger. It makes the same 365 horsepower here. You can take your pick between either a 3.8-liter naturally aspirated V6 with around 293 horsepower, or of course that 5-liter V8, which offers around 420 horsepower. The V8 definitely has that more traditional feel that a lot of luxury buyers are looking for, and you can take your pick between either rear or all-wheel drive. Remember, Genesis does not make a single vehicle that is front-wheel drive, which is not something that I could say about vehicles from Lexus or Acura or Infiniti. While the G80 is due for a redesign in 2021, this 2020 model surprisingly has a relatively fresh feel. When you drive the car, you essentially get the feeling that this is kind of like the love child of a Lexus and a Mercedes, all wrapped in some Korean, not Korean, comparison here. Now I can't remember what I was gonna say. All wrapped in a Korean, all wrapped between sheets of nori, cut up to be eaten like gimbap. All wrapped between sheets of nori, all wrapped between sheets of nori and cut up to resemble pieces of my fuck. Okay. Ugh. Let me just start over for where, gosh, that's making me hungry. Okay. Okay. This G80 Sport essentially feels like the love child between a BMW and a Lexus, all wrapped between sheets of nori, cut up to be resembling kimbap, which is a Korean form of sushi. Gosh, this is making me hungry. That was really shitty, but whatever. I was like, I think that would work. Rob's gonna be so confused. I hope I didn't mispronounce that term. Last but not least, the final model that's currently available in the Genesis lineup is the flagship G90. Now, the G90 was the first Genesis vehicle to be branded as a Genesis here in America, and the company gave the vehicle an extensive refresh for the 2020 model year. It's the first Genesis vehicle to sport their new athletic elegance design language with the crest grille at the front and the dual headlights that you see in the front fascia and the rear taillights. We saw this design language, of course, first in the GV80 sedan. I actually had a chance to be driven in the new G80 when I was in Miami last month when they showed off the new GV80 SUV. I haven't had a chance to drive the newest model. However, I remember sitting in the back of that vehicle and thinking there's a lot to offer with the G90 because you essentially get the same kind of coddling luxury that you expect from a Lexus, a Cadillac, or Mercedes. However, it has its own unique, distinctive Korean flair, and of course, while being offered at a significant price discount. Because if you guys know, the G90 starts at around $75,000. It undercuts most of its competitors by about $10,000 to as much as $30,000, depending on the trims. Now, of course, the G90 doesn't quite offer the same level of customization or engine performance options, but if that's not important to you, a lot of you are going to find a lot to like with the current G90 sedan, especially if you're actually in the market for a sedan, which typically buyers are looking for SUVs nowadays. Now, of course, coming to the final vehicle, which isn't technically on sale yet, the all-new GV80 luxury SUV. This has been a vehicle that Genesis dealers have been begging Genesis for years, and it's finally coming to the States in the summer of 2020 as a 2021 model. It's essentially going to be based on an all-new rear drive architecture. A lot of people were assuming that Genesis would just take the same front drive underpinnings as the Kia Telluride Trailride and Hyundai Palisade, but no, they decided to develop their own rear drive chassis, which will also underpin the next generation G80, which we'll see sometime in 2021. It's introducing a lot of first technologies for Genesis as a brand, including 2 all-new powertrains. On the interior, you find a luxurious cabin that really resembles a lot of the current Genesis design themes. However, you get new technology like a 14.5-inch infotainment tablet screen with augmented reality. You have a new massaging driver seats, which you could never get before on a Genesis product. And it's also introducing their next generation of safety tech, which includes autonomous emergency braking, automatic lane changes, and of course, adaptive cruise control with a predictive learning capability, so it learns your driving style and habits. Now, under the hood of the GV80, a lot of buyers are super excited for the upcoming powertrains. The standard engine will be a 2.5-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder. That's right, I said a 4-cylinder, which should be making close to 300 horsepower. That engine is essentially the same engine that I've driven in the Hyundai Sonata N line, which is still kind of in the final testing. Those of you, of course, who demand more power can choose from a 3.5-liter twin turbocharged V6, which should have close to 400 horsepower. Genesis is promising at least 375 horsepower. Both engines will be mated to an 8-speed automatic with either your choice of rear or all-wheel drive. Now, of course, Genesis G70 will be going on sale, as I said, in the summer, and Genesis is promising a starting price of under $50,000 for the base version, while the fully loaded V6 should top out around $65,000. Now, if you guys need more space and comfort versus the G70, the company also offers the G80, which is the one that I'm sitting in, the one that I've been driving all week. This is also the oldest vehicle in the Genesis lineup. It dates back to 2015. There's a new version coming. I've done multiple videos on this car. The G80 Sport is the newest addition that they introduced back in 2018. It merges the 3.3-liter twin-turbo V6 with about 365 horsepower from the G70 3.3T with either rear, like this particular one, or all-wheel drive for about $2,500 more. And you know what? For an old car, for a car that's been around for 5 years, it is still surprisingly fun to drive. And with 365 horsepower, this thing will sprint to 60 in the mid 5-second range. And you know what? This thing has a feel that I typically would not associate with a Korean car. It was one of the first Korean cars that I drove that really put a huge smile on my face, at least Korean big sedans. The Genesis Coupe was probably the very first one. Oh, geez, cutting power there a little bit, but my rear drive tester here will let the back end step out when you get a little feisty with the throttle. And you know what? The G80 Sport is quite an interesting car because it feels like the love child between a BMW and Lexus. Now, the importance of a rear drive chassis is easily apparent when you start driving any Genesis product. Even though this particular one here is rear drive only, it actually puts the power down pleasingly well. I had the traction control turned off there, floored it from a stop, and there was very little wheel spin, very little dancing whatsoever. Try that in any of the front wheel drive Acuras, Lexus, or some of the other competitors that are front drive, and you're really gonna feel a lot of torque steer or a lot of wheel hop. It's just a rather unpleasant experience. And when you're looking at a luxury car, buyers demand that kind of effortless, surge in power, that sure-footed planted feel. This car, even though it's getting up there, feels really solid, and there's a reason why it remains a relatively decent seller over at Genesis. Now, I will say the interior of the G80 is starting to look a little bit dated. This particular one here does have these updated white and black seats with the copper stitching. It does look relatively nice with the carbon fiber trim, the aluminum accents. The gauges look like they've been pulled out of a Hyundai product, which isn't a bad thing. I mean, you have a traditional analog speedometer and tachometer. There's a 7-inch helper screen in between. There's a 9.2-inch infotainment screen here that includes Android Auto and Apple CarPlay. It is a touchscreen. Genesis did update this with a touchscreen a couple years ago. You also get wireless phone charging, an electronic shifter. The seats are really comfortable. Visibility is good. So everything about this car feels like I'm sitting in a Lexus, kind of merged in with some German, engineering thrown in. But you should know that Genesis has an all-new interior design language that they just showed in the GV80. But until then, this G80 still feels really solid, really comfortable, if just a little bit dated. Now, Genesis may have been offered with only a small amount of models in their early years. However, the company is promising to be offering 6 models by the year 2022. As you guys know, we've talked about 4 models, which will be available at the end of this year if you guys are waiting for the GV80. Genesis is also promising 2 more models. Now, of course, in addition to the GV80, there will be a GV70 coming out, which is going to be a compact SUV going head-to-head with vehicles like the Audi Q5, the BMW X3, and the Mercedes-Benz GLC. This model will essentially become the best-selling vehicle in the Genesis lineup. Now, we don't know too many details yet on the GV70, just know that it will be probably around a foot shorter versus the GV80, which will be going on sale at the end of this year. Now, of course, electrification is all the news within today's media, and Genesis wouldn't be a serious player if they weren't considering a full electric vehicle. Now, at the New York Auto Show a couple of years ago, they showed off the Essentia electric sports car concept. Now, this is designed to be a full battery electric long-range vehicle, and Genesis hasn't said too much about that vehicle. They're being very tight-lipped about it. We don't know if it's going to be something like a Porsche Taycan Tesla Model S fighter or something smaller like a Tesla Model 3 fighter. However, the company did promise it will be coming out at the end of 2021, so you're going to have to wait, of course, for more news on their fully electric sports sedan, which will be coming out very soon. Now, as you guys know, SUVs are very popular in today's market, and Genesis has been also toying with the idea of offering a flagship GV90 SUV. So something that would compete along the lines of a BMW X7, a Mercedes-Benz GLS, and a Cadillac Escalade. That has not been confirmed. However, they have said that they are discussing it. So if you guys want Genesis to do something like that, be sure to leave a comment or tweet them, or just let them know that you would consider buying a full flagship SUV. Of course, everything is going to be based on how the GV80 and the upcoming GV70 do in terms of sales, but I for one hope that Genesis will do a flagship big SUV to go head-to-head with a lot of the European competitors. And finally, last but not least, you guys heard me talk about this a few times over the video, Genesis will be introducing an all-new version of the G80 sedan, which we can probably expect at the end of 2021. We also know that it will probably be based off of the platform that underpins the GV80, because as you guys know, the G80 sedan is supposed to be the sedan version of the GV80, whereas GV is going to be Genesis SUVs, while the G will essentially just be their cars. So now that we've talked about their current models, their future models, let's find out where Genesis is today. Now, to understand that, let's talk a little bit about the sales figures of Genesis and a lot of the other luxury players. Now, to do that, I've got a few notes here on my phone because these are numbers that I can't just remember. Last year, Genesis sold a total of 21,233 cars in America. That's actually up about 106% versus 2018. Now, that number definitely looks horrible when you look at some key rivals, which we'll talk about in just a moment. However, let me break down the sales figures a little bit because Genesis, as you guys know, only sold 3 models in 2019. Let's start with the smaller G70. As I said earlier, Genesis managed to sell about 12,000, a little under 12,000 G70s in all of 2019. The big brother G80 actually did worse, of course. They sold around 7,094 G80s in all of 2019. Now, that number doesn't sound like a lot. However, you should remember that the G80 competes in a segment that is essentially dying. For comparison purposes, let's look at the current Lexus GS, which is the direct competitor to the Genesis G80. In the same time frame in 2019, Lexus only managed to sell about 3,300 GS models here in the States. That's actually half of what Genesis sold of the G80. So as you can see there, Genesis is actually doing pretty well when you compare it to a main Japanese rival. Now, moving on to the flagship G90, Genesis managed to sell around 2,238 G90s in 2019. That's obviously not a lot compared to the thousands that Mercedes does for S-Class, but let's compare it to Lexus. In the same time frame, Lexus managed to sell around 5,500 LSs here in the US. That with the LS being an all-new model for 2018, sales of the LS were actually down. So the fact that Genesis was able to sell about half of what Lexus did for the LS with the G90 isn't too bad, also considering the fact of their lack of dealer network, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Now, in comparison, let's look at the competition set and how many vehicles they sold. In the same time period in 2019, Lexus sold a total of 298,000 cars. That's down 0.1% versus 2018 sales. Acura sold around 156,366 cars in 2009. That's down a much more significant 3.1% versus the same year in 2018. Infiniti was probably the worst in terms of sales. You guys saw my video on Nissan and Infiniti sales. They sold a total of 117,700 cars in 2019. That's down a staggering 21% versus that same year in 2018. Moving on for the Japanese, let's talk about the German players because they are, again, the stalwart players here in North America. Mercedes, let's start with Mercedes. They sold a total of 357,700 cars in all of 2019. That's actually up about 1% from the same time period in 2018. BMW actually also saw sales increase last year. They sold a total of 324,000 cars in all of 2019. That's up about 4.4% versus the same year in 2018. Now, of course, last but not least of the Germans, Audi, they sold a total of 224,000 cars in 2019. That's not bad, but it's about 100,000 less than BMW, which was actually up about 0.4% versus 2018. So Audi, BMW, and Mercedes actually saw sales growth in 2019 versus the same time period in 2018. Now, to throw a little bit of a wrench into all those numbers, let's talk about Tesla, because Tesla, as you guys know, is the car company that's just hotly in the media nowadays. Tesla managed to sell a total of 367,500 cars in 2019. That's up a whopping 149% versus the same time period in 2018. Now, you guys know Tesla, the Model 3 has been a huge hit for the company, but it was surprising to me when I did this list to see that Tesla sold the most amount of cars in America in the luxury space. So those of you who doubt Tesla as a brand or the seller of, or electric cars being in high demand, you might as well just take the sales figures because they don't lie. So you're probably wondering, why is Genesis selling so little vehicles compared to the most of the competition? I mean, 21,000 units versus as much as 350,000 units for some brands really is a head scratcher for a lot of people. But you should know that Genesis only offers 3 models. So they are not a full line auto manufacturer. Now, some of you may argue Tesla only offers 3 models as well, and they sold, nearly quadruple, 10 times the amount of whatever Genesis sold. However, Genesis has also been held back by the lack of a dealership network. Now, of course, if you guys look at Genesis now, the company says they have around 350 retailers here in the US. That number has actually been doubled versus 2018. So they are working very diligently to expand their dealership presence here in the US. Now, most Genesis dealers, if you guys look, are connected to Hyundai dealerships. A Hyundai dealership essentially has to, write to Genesis or become a Genesis certified dealer to sell them and to service their vehicles. And for a lot of people, if you're going to be shopping for a luxury car like a Genesis, I think some people are also turned off by the fact that, just across from the showroom floor, somebody could be looking at a $15,000 Hyundai Accent while at the same time looking at a $75,000 G90. And that could also, rub a few luxury buyers the wrong way. So I imagine Genesis is going to be working hard to create a few standalone dealerships. If you guys remember Lexus, Acura, Infiniti, they all had to start from somewhere about 30 years ago. And back then they also had trouble, selling their cars and branching off to have their own, unique standalone stores. So I imagine Genesis will be doing the same thing as the company continues to wrap up and expand their dealership network. Now, helping Genesis as a brand is the fact that they offer a few, perks that you expect as a luxury buyer. The company introduced their 3-year, 36,000 mile concierge service, which essentially includes free maintenance for 3 years or 36,000 miles. And for those of you who have to get your Genesis vehicle serviced, you don't have to be embarrassed by taking your vehicle to the Hyundai dealership to get it serviced. Genesis instead will send somebody to your home or office with a Genesis loaner that matches whatever vehicle you're putting in for service. They'll pick up the car, take it to the dealership, and then bring it back to you whenever it's done. You don't have to pay anything. You essentially can kind of, set everything on your smartphone with their app. And it's a very convenient service. That's on top of course, the long warranty that Genesis offers. The same 5-year, 60,000 mile comprehensive warranty that you get on a lot of Hyundai and Kia products, and a 10-year, 100,000 mile powertrain warranty. That warranty is actually longer than all of the other luxury players in the segment. So Genesis, of course, is going to have that on their side, which has again helped with their brand reputation. Now, of course, with a strong warranty, you all are probably wondering, how's the reliability and build quality of Genesis vehicles? Well, you'll be happy to see that for 2020, JD Power just announced Genesis as the #1 vehicle for dependability. Now, what does that mean essentially? JD Power essentially looks at 100 vehicles and they look at owners and what they say about the car of those 100 vehicles over the last 3 years. And out of all those 100 vehicles, only about 1 problem per 89 vehicles actually showed up. That's about 34% less than the industry average, making the Genesis brand one of the most dependable new vehicles you can choose from, which actually allowed it to score higher than brands like Lexus, Acura, Infiniti, Mercedes, all the actual luxury players in the space that everybody knows so well. So while Genesis may be the youngest luxury player here in America, they also have the potential to be a tier 1 luxury brand and really challenge the dominance that the Japanese and the Germans have enjoyed for years. Unlike some of the competitors competitors, Genesis didn't just reskin a lot of front-wheel drive Hyundai and Kia mainstream cars. They developed their own dedicated rear drive platforms, paired those platforms with potent turbocharged 6-cylinder, 4-cylinder, and of course a V8 engine. And they also offer an interior that really stands out in the segment for offering a lot of quality, a lot of value, a lot of technology at a much more significant price discount versus a lot of the, again, competition. Sure, some of you may still say, oh, Genesis is just a fancy Hyundai vehicle. However, you could say the same thing about Acura and Honda, Lexus and Toyota, Nissan and Infiniti. So really what Genesis offers is a lot in this segment, which in the luxury space, typically you don't get value. Genesis offers a lot of value. You typically don't get a killer warranty to boot. Genesis offers that along with their 3-year, 36,000 mile scheduled concierge service. And if you haven't driven a Genesis or a recent Hyundai and Kia product, you'll find that they've really improved their driving dynamics. That's of course thanks to Albert Bierman and his design team or his engineering team for making these vehicles drive a lot better. This G80 Sport, as you guys saw, drives extremely well. It's quick, it's refined, it's smooth, it's comfortable. It's really everything that I expect in a luxury sedan, kind of wrapped in their own Genesis aura, which I think is important. Genesis is starting to really find where they fit in the segment, especially that's going to come to play when the GV80 comes out, their GV70 SUV, their all-new electrified sedan platform, and of course, maybe even a flagship GV90 SUV. So I think once Genesis gets their dealership network together and they really start advertising these vehicles a lot more, they really start pushing out, their cars out to customers and having their own standalone dealerships, I really see Genesis becoming a dominant player in the ever-competitive and growing luxury space. And it's why I feel Genesis has the potential to be a tier 1 luxury player. But with all that said, I hope you guys have enjoyed this video on Genesis and where they're headed in the future, where they came from their past. If you're also looking to see the latest cars I'm testing, be sure to follow me on Instagram at redline_reviews. Like us on Facebook, and as always, guys, please keep subscribing to the Redline Reviews YouTube channel for all the latest reviews. Thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you all in the next video.